I'm John Law, this is Chasing Cars, and this is a 2021 Kia Picanto GT-Line, which means it's got the 1.25 litre big block 4-cylinder engine, not the turbo triple that Tom reviewed a couple of months back. But we're going to come back to all of that in just a minute, because this Picanto's main calling card is it's give or take the cheapest car you can buy in Australia, save perhaps the very average Mitsubishi Mirage. So we're going to see if this Kia manages to combine any cheeriness with that cheapness in just a second. So in today's review, we're going to do our normal thing where we check out the interior and the practicality before we take it out for a little drive. But first I want to talk about the styling of this GT line, because it adopts this rather aggressive body kit and 16-inch alloy wheels from its more powerful GT brother. And I think it looks pretty chunky, but you can let me know what you think in the comments section down below. Now, if you don't know exactly what the Picanto is or where it sits in the Australian car lineup, we'll slide into the interior. This car's about 400 millimeters shorter than a Mazda 2, so you'd expect space to be at a premium inside this car, but surprisingly, in the front cabin, it all feels very nice and airy, no doubt due to its rather tall, sort of almost micro minivan proportions outside. And the other good thing about the cabin is that it's really rather well appointed where you need it to be, certainly for the $19,500 asking price on the road here in New South Wales of this GT line. So let's start with some of the really good features. We get a leather-wrapped steering wheel, which is an upgrade over the base model, and you also get a leather-wrapped automatic gear shifter, which is a nice little touch. You've got some pretty decent leather padding where you touch, and the seats are leather. Of course, they're not real leather, they're just a leatherette, same with the steering wheel and all the other bits of padding. But everything you touch in this car has a remarkable feeling of quality. It feels quite solidly hewn. Of course, when you start looking for things in the interior that are scratchy, you'll not have very far to look, because the door cards are really oppressively scratchy and the dashboard is all hard touch. There's no real excess soft touch materials in here, but the quality feel is reasonable. So if you don't go poking around looking for unpleasant plastics like we do in reviews, you probably won't find that it's too bad. As for the design, it's pretty basic. So you've got two analog dials, which are relatively clear, and you've got a central screen in the middle, which can read out speed, which is something that not every car in this class has. So you've got digital speed readout, so you don't have to worry so much about getting speeding fines. You've also got this 8-inch touchscreen here. Now, there's no navigation on any of the Picantos, but on every Picanto in Australia, you get standard wireless Apple CarPlay and Android Auto. And that's huge. That's something you really only see in the luxury class normally. However, it isn't quite as polished as systems you find in BMW. There are a couple of dropouts that you do experience with the phone, but presumably over the life of this car, the updates will make it a little bit better. You've got some really simple climate control dials just below here. Obviously, it's not climate control, it's just aircon, and a USB port, a 12-volt socket, and some pretty handy storage areas, including two sort of level storage for your phone here. No wireless charging or anything like that, of course. And these nifty little cup holders with little pop-out holsters. They're not quite big enough for like a 700ml bottle, but they'll hold a small coffee cup or a small bottle really nicely. You've got some weird odds and ends storage just under this manual handbrake here, and under this tiny little armrest you have a tiny little storage cubby, but at least there's something to store some valuables in there. As well, you've got pretty decent door pockets, and yeah, overall, for the size of this vehicle, the front seat is actually pretty practical. It's just a shame that the seats are a little bit flat and lack any real adjustment. Now let's hop into the back of the Picanto GT line and see whether or not at just 3,595 millimeters, I have any space back here at 6'2". And would you believe it? This is actually one of the more comfortable small cars I've sat in recently. As you can probably see, I've got really agreeable amounts of headroom for me at 6'2", which is crazy. And although my seat is in my driving position, i.e. pretty far back, my knees are touching the seat. However, it's got a soft back, so I would actually be relatively comfortable back here. Now, of course, it's not a car that you're going to be regularly carrying lots of people in. However, if you need to carry 4 people, say you're popping to the beach and you want to bring your housemates along with you, this car is actually plenty agreeable. As for creature comforts, the scratchy plastics do return pretty oppressively here in the back, especially on the armrest. There's no central armrest, air vents or charging ports back here, But the Squab itself is remarkably comfortable. And as I said, as a car where you're just going to be maybe chucking a couple of extra people or maybe a dog in the back seat occasionally, it's pretty agreeable, and I don't think it's too bad. Now around to the rear, where I think perhaps the Picanto is a little bit of an awkward looking hatchback. It's quite tall, and as I said, it's got these weird sort of micro minivan proportions that are not to everyone's tastes. Needs a little bit more low, a little bit more wheel width, I reckon, and it might look pretty wicked, but we can do that in the aftermarket. Now underneath this incredibly light boot lid, of course it's not electrically operated, but we don't mind that because it's just so light, you get 255 litres of space. Now being a low car, do have a bit of a load lip to carry stuff over, but again, it's not such a big deal. You do get a space saver spare tyre under that boot floor as well, and when you fold the seats down, you can just about carry a road bike with both wheels off. So for me, the Picanto is a remarkably practical little car, and I haven't had any issues living with it really day to day. You just have to understand it is what it is. So let's see if it can bring any extra cheer when we take it out for a spin on the road. So now we get to talk about the fun part of the Kia Picanto, which is driving. And fundamentally, this car is very basic. However, Kia have got the basic fundamentals quite right, to a point where even as a very affordable vehicle, I quite enjoy driving this thing around. Now that is slightly eroded by the engine choice in this particular variant. It's got a 1.25 litre 4-cylinder engine, which is pretty old school. It's multi-point injection, so not direct injection, and it just feels, yeah, shouty, loud. Outputs are pretty measly, 62 kilowatts and 122 newton meters. Now it's handy enough to motivate this little Picanto off the line to about 50 k's an hour, but anything above that kind of just feels stressed. It feels quite hard working, this engine, when you start pushing it a little harder, and it's not exactly helped by the small number of ratios in this automatic gearbox. It's a 4-speed auto, and that's pretty old school, and it's quite slush boxy. It's definitely not a refined gearbox, what you'd call it, but it does the job. And as I said, up to 50 k's an hour, this little Picanto actually gets its skates on pretty well. You can of course opt for a much more enjoyable 1 litre turbo 3-cylinder engine in the GT. So one step up from this. It's only about $1,000 more than this car, but it is only available with a manual gearbox. So that might put some people out of consideration for it, but that really suits this little car well, and it's a little bit lighter than this engine. So with that engine, the Picanto then weighs under 1,000 kilos, where with the auto gearbox and the 1.25 litre engine, this weighs just over 1,000 kilos. As for fuel economy, we averaged 7.2 litres per 100 kilometres on our test loop, but around urban environments, you're going to see that blow out a little bit to sort of about 8.5 litres per 100 in the city and in the suburbs. So it's not hugely incredible given the low power of this engine. Even more of a reason in my book to go for the 1 litre turbocharged engine, which gets you better fuel economy as well as better power. Now let's talk a little bit about the chassis and the suspension. Now the Picanto, we're not going to lie, it's going to spend most of its time in an urban setting. And that's kind of a good thing for this car, because that's where it feels like it's got things pretty well right. So the ride is a little bit harsh because of a set of 16-inch alloy wheels. Now they're not huge obviously, but on a car as small as this, they're pretty big. So you do get a little bit of harshness from those when you're driving around town, especially on sort of a small, sharp, short-edged bumps. They can sort of jar into the cabin pretty noticeably. But that's not the end of the world. And once you get some speed on the Picanto, surprisingly, the ride improves. It becomes very fluid. The damping control is very good. There's no lolloping around. Rebound is a very one-and-done scenario, and it feels under control. And the chassis is also fairly dynamic. I'm not going to say it's going to set your world on fire. It's no Peugeot 205 GTI in this iteration, though the GT gets a little bit closer. But it is somewhat enjoyable. There's a little bit of a balance for you to play with there. The general tendency is mild understeer, and on a slightly damp day like this, that can progress into pretty heavy understeer. It does not really helped by these not so grippy Eco Nexen tyres. It gives some perverse enjoyment in absolutely hooning down a country road with the throttle flat wide open most of the time. So I actually quite enjoyed my time on a back road in a Picanto. The other great thing about this car is the steering. Kia has really done a number with the steering in this car. It's got a really good ratio, nice sized steering wheel as we've already covered, and it's quite quick. It's almost sports car-like, but without being too jerky. And there's really good movement off center, and the weighting is just about right. So surprisingly, Kia has really nailed the steering on this car, which makes it feel a lot more enjoyable than a car with bad steering, for example. Unfortunately, a trade-off of such a small car, of course, is going to be noise, vibration and harshness. We already covered the engine's a pretty shouty little unit, and it's not really a very well insulated car. There's quite a high space for sound to jiggle around in, and you do get quite a bit of thump from that torsion beam rear end coming through into the cabin, which can be pretty loud, and the general road noise on coarse chip surfaces especially is pretty roary. But then again, it's a cheap car, so you're not buying the Picanto to be a long distance country cruiser that's going to be, you know, sort of Mercedes S-Class levels of refinement. So for its use purpose, it's fine, and around the city on smooth roads like we're on at the moment, it's pretty good. But as I said, that rear suspension torsion beam thwump can come through into the cabin pretty loudly. And then finally, that brings us on to safety features of the Picanto, and unfortunately it is lacking quite a lot of the things that we are starting to want to see in small cars like this, especially for first car buyers. It's something that you're going to want to really consider, because this car is only rated with 4 stars in the 2017 NCAP safety rating test. That's because it misses out on some key bits of active safety tech. So it does have low speed AEB and forward collision warning, but it misses out on any pedestrian detection and rear AEB as well. It doesn't have any reverse AEB, not surprising. This GT line does get a couple of niceties. You do get rear parking sensors, and across the range you get a rear view camera, which is fairly crisp and good to use. The other safety point worth mentioning in this Picanto is that while it does have traction control and ESP, they are pretty rudimentary systems, and in practice it takes a long time for that ESP to kick in and do anything, certainly about understeer. So it's not quite as well equipped as some more expensive rivals in the safety department, but it is a lot better than some of the vehicles that it competes with, like the Mitsubishi Mirage and the Suzuki Swift, for example. Now, the other thing about the Picanto and cars in general of this size is that the active safety gear isn't such a crucial point, because they're so small and they're so airy. This Picanto's got incredible vision out, and the small size of it means it's a super easy car to maneuver in town. You got a really short turning circle, and it's just a very simple car to park, very square, very easy proportions to use in practice. So in a lot of respects, it deletes the need for safety features, but we've still got to mention that they are lacking. So what are our detailed opinions of the 2021 Kia Picanto? Well, it's a really sweet little package. It's cheap, it's cheerful, and it's a pretty fun thing to drive. In fact, it's better to drive than a lot of light SUVs, and despite its diminutive dimensions, it's actually more spacious inside than some of its more expensive light SUV counterparts like the Mazda CX-3. So for me, I'm a really big fan of this Picanto, and especially when you go for that punchy little turbo 3-cylinder GT, which has that little hint of Peugeot 205 to it, which I really like. But you can let me know what you think of the Picanto in the comments section down below. Would you go for this car, or are you an SUV fan? Just let me know in the comment section down below. While you're down there, we'd love it if you could hit subscribe, the bell icon, and as always, thank you for watching Chasing Cars.